you. Yeah, welcome everybody to our last session here on Circular Society Forum 2022. We had two very inspiring and full days, so I'm already looking forward to have a very slow lunch afterwards because I didn't bring my brown bag here because I'm moderating. So that's our last step, and this last step is designed to look in the future and tackle a question that has bothered me also for the last couple of years, how we can have a more serious grasp of the global dimension of circular society. But just to start, here is again the team that we have shown several times during the conference, and I just want to use the occasion to thank everybody in the team for their great work and the wonderful collaboration that we have together. I think that we again had a very nice time here at the Circular Society Forum, and I think that's really due to the good preparation, but also the very nice participants and the inputs we had here. I haven't mentioned Pete, who also did a great job in supporting us, but he's not there with us, so we will thank him later. So that's again the team. But now we are in our brown bag panel, Circular Society Goes Global, International Perspectives and Circularity. I already reminded the recording, so I don't have the reminder anymore here. The background idea of Circular Society Goes Global brown bag panel was to kind of try to think more what some of the basic principles of circular society mean for a global perspective. And on the left side, I just quoted one of our papers on circular society, where we wrote that the normative indicators of the circular society, like democratization, accessibility, collaboration, communality, and so on, they need to be constantly re-evaluated. So we can't just define what they mean, because those are process indicators. Those things are performed, and during the performance we need to exchange on them, negotiate them, and integrate multiple perspectives, belief systems, and needs from different sectors, social groups, disciplines, and cultures. And we also wrote that it entails a dialogue between North and South, young and old, materialists, minimalists, feminists, conservationists, everybody in the end. And we say that by paying particular attention to social justice, equity, and inclusion, we need to build on the voices of the many. That's a very big word, a very big slogan that we put out. And it's really hard. I mean, it's easy to say that, but it's hard to kind of get it into motion, kind of perform and practice it. And there has been some recent publications that already debate the role of a circular economy on a global scale and what it entails for different countries in this world. For example, one paper by Barry and others, and Manisha was also involved in that. It talks about the circularity divide, and it says that if the economy a circular economy transition is conducted as a race between nations, then advanced industrialized nations hold a significant competitive advantage. And this advantage is set to increase as economic contest and systemic risks in the global economy intensify. So unequal power relations and value chains disadvantage developing countries. Kircher wrote in a paper on circular justice that he developed the example of circular textiles and how in a world in which jeans, for example, is least and ultra durable, and where vintage shops replace fast fashion, there is a world with fewer textile jobs in some countries. And I mean, those jobs are not often jobs that are very good in a way. So people are treated very bad, and they have a lot of their health and their life situation, their well-being is not considered. But at the same time, just taking the jobs away wouldn't do it. So there are just an example how different publications mention different problems here. And I think it's a good time to think about how circular society as a concept, and maybe also as a political program, which when it will be uptaken by policymakers, can make a difference here maybe, and what we need to develop further in order to make this contribution. So the questions that I would like to raise here today, together with my wonderful panel, is what needs to be considered if we think circular society global? So what is behind those big words that I mentioned before? What can be behind it? What are the nitty-gritty kind of important challenges that we have to face? The other question is, how do global relations in different dimensions like economic, political, cultural, and social aspects change in circular transitions, and what are trade-offs, backdrops, and opportunities? And if we really take as serious that the circular society puts intergenerational justice in the core of its agenda, what are the most important issues in the relations between Global South and Global North, and which need serious consideration? And what are ideas for joint collaboration and exchange for the future? So I'm happy to introduce my three panelists here. First of all, Manisha Anantharaman. She has many affiliations. One of it is that she is Associate Fellow at the Environment Society Program in Chatham House, Royal Institute for International Affairs. She is also a professor for Justice, Community, and Leadership at the Berkeley and at the San Maurice College of California in the Bay Area, so a very nice part of this world. Currently, she's, I think, located in Tunisia, so a global citizen by heart. She is a multidisciplinary scholar, and she is combining different methods and disciplinary perspectives in her research, and she's looking very holistically at politics and pathways of sustainability transitions. I already mentioned some papers of hers, so she's also dealing with the global issues of circular economy and its problems. We have Ilaha Abasli here, who already presented in the session before, who is a PhD researcher. You wouldn't think that, you would think she's a professor, but she's still a PhD researcher at the International Institute of Social Studies in Rotterdam. And she holds a master's degree in international development and emerging economies. She studied in London. And she is engaged with different big NGOs and big agencies like the FAO, the GIZ, and other local NGOs, where she's doing work on circular economy in the Global South in different countries. And in the end, we have Subhasis who is from a professor of marketing at the Xavier Institute of Marketing in Bhubaneswar in India. He has a broad experience in different sorts of managerial dilemmas related to sustainability, who's researching about corporate social responsibility, and has lately also dived into the issue of sustainable circular economy, where he did a project, for example, on circularity with one of India's largest automotive companies. So different countries, different perspective, different people. And I'm happy to get short input from everybody concerning our questions, so about 5 minutes per person. And then we open up the panel discussion by having some rounds of questions. And you in the audience are all invited to ask questions. And in the chat first, maybe, and then you can also raise your hand. So I just put, first of all, Manisha in the foreground. So would you please start with your remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Melanie, for this invitation, and nice to see everybody here. So I'll start off by making, I think, a very simple comment, but I think is an important one, and it ties a little bit to the brown bag keynote given yesterday by Hervé Corvalec and Alison Stowell. So if we think about what needs to be considered if we think of the circular society globally, I think the first point is that the linear economy is global. And indeed, the linear economy maintains its cost effectiveness, maintains its competitive edge through a set of social relations, a set of global social relations that are exploitative, that engage in the unjust appropriation, sometimes the forceful appropriation of resources and cheap labor from minoritized or marginalized parts of the world. So I think this context that the linear economy gets its competitive edge from these global relations is really important to consider while we think about a transition to a circular economy. That is not simply going to go away. Now, if we kind of take that backdrop into account, that global supply chains are characterized by these unequal power relations, the argument that my colleagues at Chatham House and I, so Jack Barry, Patrick Schroeder, and others have been making, is that in the absence of explicit efforts to to address inequality and to address unequal power relations, circular economy interventions are bound to replicate, reproduce, and sometimes even worsen those inequalities. So in this article on the Circularity Divide, and I'll just put a link here to my website where all the papers that I'm referencing, you will find links to them. And then if you need PDFs, I'm happy to send those to you. So what we're basically arguing here is that if the circular economy emerges primarily as a green growth or a national economic competitiveness strategy, and countries take up policies and actions on the circular economy unilaterally, and the EU acting unilaterally, US acting unilaterally, China acting unilaterally, then you're going to have a situation where there is a drive to guard resources, to guard materials within national borders, which are going to impact existing flows and chains in which largely minoritized, working class, racialized communities depend on right now. So as a simple example, say you still have a linear economy operating, right? So in that situation, you're going to have, let's take batteries, for example, like EV batteries. So in order to make batteries, companies are going to want to source those materials that go into batteries from the countries where those are available, global South countries, countries largely in Africa. They're going to bring them in. They're going to kind of bring those materials in, manufacture batteries. But then if they set up recycling and refurbishment systems within their own domestic boundaries, then those global South countries are going to lose access to these materials in double ways, right? So because the initial extraction process is still going on, and now the repair, refurbishment, recycling cycle, which may previously have taken place in a global South country, and yes, absolutely in difficult circumstances, if that gets brought into the territorial borders of a powerful country, then they're going to retain those existing resources in perpetuity. And this is actually the plan. So this is not, an outcome. This is the plan. So I think we also have to kind of make that clear. Another issue is the issue of the digital divide and digitalization, and the extent to which a lot of the circular economy, circular society transitions depend on digital solutions, digital interventions, how an existing digital divide between different parts of the world, which again goes beyond north-south boundaries, there are also south-south differences in access to digital technologies. That in turn is going to mean that people aren't starting at a level playing field. So in our article on the Circularity Divide, we basically lay this out and say that in the absence of explicit measures to both acknowledge these inequalities, the sources and social mechanisms that keep them in place, that keep them operational, there is a cycle by which they will be reinforced. So then what are some of the ways out of this? My personal pet peeve is against the word win-win. I think that the phrase win-win has to leave discussions of the circular economy and the circular society. And there is this kind of tendency to present this as, we can end poverty and save the environment and continue to grow our economies and provide jobs all at the same time. And my research just basically says that that's not true. Circular economy interventions might improve the livelihoods, for example, of a small subset of informal economy actors by, selecting some to be social entrepreneurs, but actually leaves a majority of them at the margins of global flows. And I think in the absence of win-win, we actually need a focus on reparation, recognizing that our global economy is actually one that has been built upon violence and exploitation. And the circular society can be a way of healing those violences through the material bonds it creates. So in an opinion piece, we argue for a global reparation fund to actually support and to invest in upskilling and upgrading those existing material resource recovery practices in the global South, and recognizing that in the absence of investment without an expectation of returns, so in other words, reparation, attempts to kind of create these new global circular economy flows by including the informal economy, by including poor people, inclusion can in of itself serve as a mechanism for renewing exploitation. So yeah, I'll say that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great first input. So I'm handing over to Ilaha. who is now in the spotlight.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. And thanks, Manisha. Like, I think that it was really great points. So it's a bit always hard to talk after a great speaker. But yeah, to answer to like why we need to talk about global south when we talk about circularity, I think that Manisha has covered it very well. I mean, the answer is very simple because most of the resources that we use, especially the source of the raw materials, the virgin raw materials, are coming from global south countries. But also, interestingly, most of the sources that we use and we call waste are dumped into the global south countries. So if you think of the circularity as a life cycle assessment that is very popular to do in the circularity, both in the end, both in the beginning and the end of this life cycle of the materials are actually related with the global south as a space and as a medium of the processes. So that's why it's very, very important to understand global south. But I'm also in my PhD, I'm trying to understand global south. I call it mostly low and middle income countries. I try to understand that it is not a singular and unified space and phenomenon and the concept, but rather it's very complex and it's very diverse. And there are also a lot of power and different processes within the global south countries. So as I said, I've done my field work in Kenya. So I'm looking at the case of Kenya, what happens there, both from informal and formal perspective, and how the circularity of Kenya is also linked to the global circularity policies and initiatives. And it's interesting because as we talk about the Kenya, in the case of Kenya, it seems like a very unified country, but when you dig into the country, you see that the processes are very complex in terms of what kind of actors are involved in decision making, in the governance, in the material allocation, what kind of actors are recognized, and etc. So it's very multi-layer process and mechanism. So that's my one argument that we need to dive into, and there is a bit of fallacy, academic fallacy in unifying global south, and because global south is very much diverse, and also the income and other indicators are very diverse. And the second interesting fact, and I think the highlights in my work is the role of international donors, and from global north to global south, that I am currently trying to understand and doing a bit of the discourse analysis and also interviews regarding that. This is very interesting. On which project, and there is, because the circular economy is becoming a big thing in most of the global south countries, and there's the influx of the money, international money, but the money goes to certain sectors, to certain projects, to certain type of material circularity in certain areas and with certain actors. So it is important to understand that how through funding these projects and programs, and sometimes also the policies, we replicate already existing inequalities and both power and the wealth inequalities in the world between the global north and the global south, and international donors, organizations, and international funding into circularity has been a major enabling tool for that. And in that sense, it is very similar what international donors and global north actors have been doing in other fields, like in humanitarian fields, we can name other classic international development projects. In a way, it is very similar as a dynamics, what happens with the influx of the international money. But in other sense, it's very interesting because there is a direct material interest of these global north countries. And one good example that I'm based in the Netherlands, so I can bring the example of the Dutch funding towards most of the East African countries and the particular Kenya. So Dutch funding has been flooded to particular plastics sector, into particular PET recycling in low and middle income countries, where obviously they have this very small activities on formalizing the labor market, where they hire informal laborers and they train them, but it's very much an anecdotal example. But when you analyze why Dutch government, I mean, most of the Dutch companies, corporates are interested in plastics, then you understand there is a, you trace it back to the interest of the Netherlands, and then you understand, yes, there is a big interest in finding solution PET, because they also want to get rid of the PET, and etc. So just to wrap up, I think that's one angle that I'm trying to understand more, and I think that's very important to highlight that there is another, as Manisha already mentioned, another replication, and there is a fallacy of replicating already existing the mistakes of the linear system in the circular system through this the international funds and the international money that's comes from global north to global south. So that was my initial ad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And further items in terms of the list of important items. Thank you. So now the last panelist, and then we start with our round of questions. Subhasis, please.
Thank you, Melanie and the hosts for this invite. And I must admit that my research is the infant stage on circular economy. So please excuse me if my points seem to be naive. So I just thought about some of the issues that I have seen while reading or teaching or researching sustainability in general, and to some extent circular economy. And I think like Manisha and Ilaha made some great points. The defining feature of the global south is inequality and poverty. I think that we all agree there. But if you, I do not know, but I have studied how poor people consume and live, because I happen to work in a business school, and right across the road, we have an urban slum having 150,000 people. So for other projects, I have looked very closely at their lives, and my feeling is poor people in general are circular. Because they have to be, but it's not something they would do if they get more money. And I think there is a lot of implication of that, because the bottom of the pyramid, as we popularly say in management, is the largest consumer base. But this is not just in India. I have seen, for example, I just remembered one of my visits to Technical University Braunschweig many years back, and I was staying at a home. And somebody just pointed out a small potato plant planted by her neighbor. And the background is this lady survived the Second World War. She was a child, but she still feels that in case there is another bombing, it's good to have a potato nearby. So the idea of resource scarcity and our behavior in response to that is in some way global and in some way local. But the answers to the circularity may also lie in, for example, Indian mythology and spirituality, where we talk about the cycle of desire. And Indian mythology and spirituality says that you cannot move from desiring a new object, which is a sort of expression of your desire, to something which is circular, let's say repaired or remanufactured. And I see that getting reflected in the poor people's consumption. None of them would really want to have a repaired, remanufactured mobile or a TV or a shoe if they can. But at a macro level, I think this whole idea of sustainable consumption is sort of pushed to us by the neoliberal economy, and they're trying to wash off their hands on the responsibility of sustainable production, circular production. So I worked closely with one of India's largest automobile companies, and I could see that the whole initiative of circularity is actually driven by two things: their interest to go global and raise funds and create a global brand. And then circularity was a means to that end, which raises certain questions. But even at the level of smaller organizations like social enterprises, I worked with a company which was making cloth pads for women for menstrual hygiene. And I could see that people, who would struggle to buy a product made by multinationals like Procter & Gamble or Johnson & Johnson would still go and buy those products. They will not buy a cloth pad which they could use for 5 years. So there are issues of culture, consumer culture, and how people think about consumption. But the other point is, I think most of the discussion that's coming from the global north, from the West, is essentially from a perceived scarcity point of view. So that scarcity, most of the people who are writing about them, doing it, they have not seen it. But in the South, it's an experienced scarcity. People are experiencing that either themselves or by people around them. And that changes the whole discourse, the experienced versus the perceived. The other second last point I would say is sort of going back to what Manisha was telling. I guess that circularity may actually entrench discrimination and inequality like caste in the Indian society. To give an example, the person who repairs shoes very near to my business school, I had a chat with him inspired by this invitation to understand what happens. And to cut a long story short, he is from one of those so-called lower castes, and he really has no other way but to do this. And if we think of shoes, making circular shoes, I don't see the lot of these guys improving. In fact, they can be further impoverished when this whole circularity is taken over by organized chains and makes it global, like Ilaha and Manisha said. And of course, there are issues of criminalization and mafias in these sort of waste management processes. So what do we require to answer some of the questions that are getting raised here? One is definitely multi-level analysis, but also how the levels interact with each other. For example, in my city, we are using transgenders for waste collection. So it would be quite interesting for me to understand whether discrimination against transgenders have increased or decreased because of their cohabitation with waste collection, which itself is, again, in the hierarchy of work, one of the lowest that you can find in India, typically done by the Dalits or the so-called untouchables. But if we think of solutions, those solutions also need to be exciting, they need to be affordable, they need to be impactful. So what actions we can take? The last question that Melanie asked. This is something which I keep saying when I go to international conferences, is to invite some of the top scholars and practitioners and policymakers of the world who are working with circular economy to the poorest regions of the global South, for them to experience it even for a day. Because that experiential scarcity, that it can move from being perceived to experienced. And I think that can change the discourse a lot. We can start with a small pilot, take one product and look at the global change. So these are some of the thoughts I have to share. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm trying to put you all into the spotlight. A second. Okay. And I also put me inside, so not because I'm so pretty, but because we are on the panel. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I have put a lot of notes, and in the end, I'm going to have a slide where I try to summarize a bit the points, and I hope I took it well, but now we will have some more. So my first question to this round is, there's no question in the chat yet, is, I mean, in Germany, when we are building the circular society kind of network, we are building a lot on interaction and collaboration with civil society. I mean, Hans-Sauer Stiftung as a foundation would also be part of a civil society. And what are your experiences concerning the role of civil society in raising the same questions and criticisms that you raise? So is there some, there's a talk, we had a cat already interrupting, very nice. So what do you think, how powerful can it be to interact with civil society, and how do they kind of see circular economy? Do they also formulate alternative approaches to that? So maybe we start with the round again, starting with Manisha and then Boy. No.
Could you come back to me?
Should I repeat the question?
No, she wants to go last.
Come back to me. Come back to me. Yeah.
We can start with Ilaha.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's an interesting question. When it comes to the role of civil society, I think I've mentioned in the previous discussion that I feel in my experience in the European Union, there is a bigger space for involvement of the civic initiatives, like neighborhood initiatives, we can say in the case of Rotterdam, even in The Hague, in Amsterdam, for example, Netherlands. There are involvements of this grassroots initiatives and civic groups and civil society, etc. But there are two problematic sides of this involvement. The first side is demographics. What kind of groups are getting involved, even there are grassroots. So in the case of Netherlands, I think there was a study, I can't remember the name of the author, but so I'm sorry about it, but like there was a study actually about the grassroots involvement on circularity, and it shows that actually it is not very much diverse. It is, yeah, it's pretty much, yeah, it's pretty much involvement of the very Dutch neighborhoods, upper middle income neighborhoods, and etc. So there is no racial background or class diversity. So that's one problematic side. And the second problematic side is that most of the times the involvement is on a practice level, and it is hard to escalate those involvement, that feedback through the participatory, the policy making, as though they try most of the places, most of the countries, it is challenging to, yeah, perpetuate those interventions to really policy making level. So I think that are the two highlights of the problematic sides of involvement in civic society. But when it comes to global south and more like low and middle income countries, involvement of civic initiatives or like it's more established civil society seems to be less. And one reason is that most of in most of the global south countries, the agenda is very much dominated by state and the private sector, and the third actor, as I mentioned, it is international donors. And in this pyramid and hierarchy, the community level initiatives, civic society, grassroots initiatives, neighborhood, individual initiatives, and all, etc., all these actors, they are in the end, in the bottom of this hierarchy. And most of the times they are not getting access unless they have a personal network and or etc. And but the other side of the question is interesting because we assume that they are interested in participating in circularity discussions, but sometimes not. In my field work, it was very interesting when I was talking to informal brokers. So the brokers being engaged in the informal material management and waste picking, etc. And they were just not interested in getting engaged in this discussion because they had this fear that if they get engaged, they might lose their livelihoods because some initiatives, like just quoting, someone will come and formalize and they will lose all their access, which by someone they means usually either state or private sector. So so we assume that by default they should be interested, but sometimes they're not interested. And I think that then their reluctance and their not being interested is very interesting to understand what, because I think that the magic lays behind it, this question. And but yeah, like most of the times, at least in my experience, all the community level initiatives and civic society organizations, and I'm talking also about not gongos, like not government NGOs, but like more authentic civic initiatives. They're not involved at all, and they're not. And when I mean involved, it's also the mechanisms. They are not they are not invited to the discussion tables. They are not part of the consortiums that draft policies, give feedback, and usually it's most state and the private sector alliances in most of the global south countries. And some countries are challenging it in an interesting way. For example, one country that it's very interesting is Uruguay. They try to integrate the circular economy initiatives and more like community approaches to the policies. And even in their policy documents, there is, even in terms of the language used, there is a lot of community words, society words, initiative words, which is one of the standing out cases in comparison to other countries. But yeah, so that's my very brief insight on this involvement of the civic. But I think that just to end, I think for me, the question is not whether they are engaged or not, but it's most also how they're engaged and to what extent their engagement actually delivers a good outcome. So because most of the times, even in Europe, as I mentioned, it can be just a matter of tokenism, just for the sake of having them on the board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Subhasis, you want to, or Manisha, who wants first?
Sure. I'm happy to go. Apologies, somebody rang the doorbell and my dog like lost it on perfect storm moment. I think Ilaha's points are really important, and I'll just add a little on to those. So even the term civil society, right? And I think this is one of those contexts where that term has a particular meaning, a particular function in a place like Europe, and actually works very differently in many global South countries. So for example, in a place like India, civil society is known to be a space that is exclusionary and that's exclusive. And so Subhasis, for example, mentioned the issue of caste. There is a very large literature and practice work that shows how civil society organizations have been exclusive and exclusionary, particularly leaving out working class people, leaving out Dalits, and actually putting forward agendas that serve the interests of the more privileged and more powerful in that society. I think, first of all, civil society in of itself is not a neutral term. Now, then to go to Ilaha's point, which civil society organizations are included, right? And I think we see, especially when it comes to something like the circular economy that brings together multinational corporations and global development organizations and donor agencies, there's certainly a cherry picking of civil society organizations that are more likely to kind of toe a particular kind of line, follow, the incentives, the initiatives of the more powerful players. And I think this is also one of the reasons why some partnerships have failed. For example, this UN STEP initiative that tried to link informal e-waste recyclers in Bangalore with smelters in Europe through NGOs failed because those informal recyclers did not trust the NGO. They certainly did not trust the UN STEP agency, and they did not trust the smelter in Europe. And that is because there are existing kind of cultural differences, power relationships that I think we need to be aware of when we talk about civil society. And then I think the kind of a related point is a focus on collaboration. I think sometimes here can actually be very constraining. In many of the milieux where decisions around work, around labor, around rights, around dignity are made, those are not collaborative spaces. They are conflictual political spaces. And there is something about the ways in which we think about civil society or assume civil society to operate that actually removes the potential for conflict. And that is why in civil society spaces, for example, trade unions are less likely to be successful than an NGO that publishes annual reports. So I think maybe also we need to think a little bit about how much importance we are giving to collaboration, and can we really bring all the players together to collaborate, or is that some sort of like utopian vision that is doomed to fail? And instead we need a model of change and engagement that embraces conflict, that recognizes that everybody has an interest, a vested interest, and works with that and actually tries to come to a place of agreement with conflict.
Very important issue. The romance of participation is also a problem here. Okay, Subhasis, yes, you have something to add, I think.
I think great point. First of all, I must congratulate Ilaha for mentioning Uruguay. I mean, we hardly hear Uruguay in discussions, so nice to remind us of those places. So I have been looking at the CSR space in India for the last 10 years and trying to draw a parallel, thinking that what would happen, what has happened to the civil society with corporate social responsibility becoming mandatory in the country. And I would guess something similar would happen. So what has happened is Now, once CSR or circular economy gets sort of formalized through government articulations, I see a marketization of the concept. So markets are created for enacting or defining the players, defining their performances. So what is right now happening with ESG, for example, environmental, social, and governance, is a large number of so-called civil society coming up and ranking companies, rating companies, awarding and bizarre type of, awards and sectoral and geographic. But so I'm saying you may find new forms of civil society getting formed just for the marketization impact of a particular concept coming in. The second thing I have seen in areas like ESG or CSR, and I'm sure it will happen in circular economy, is the small versus large conflict. So often these discourses, particularly the one type of collaborations we are talking about, age out the smaller ones. And Manisha was sort of referring to that. So very interesting cases of a company selecting a smaller NGO, but then rejecting it in favor of a large national NGO who ultimately outsourced it to the smaller one. So these dynamics change, depending on the politics of that's happening. But also there is a bigger politicization of sustainability between developing and developed. And I can see that playing out even in the circular economy, in terms of financing, but also the roles of civil society are now being questioned as anti-growth. So this is like a growth versus development debate, which in a sense, in my case, would actually also limit the flow of talent to the space. I already sense that lesser and lesser number of talented individuals are looking at the civil society space to spend their lives in. And it's partially because of the politicization and marketization that I talked about. So, briefly, those are my points.
Okay, thanks a lot for this round. We have one question in the chat. Regina, would you like to raise the question yourself, or should I read it?
I can try to explain, but as you know, my microphone is sometimes difficult. If you don't hear me, then yeah, you can also read it. So I was wondering, Ilaha, for example, mentioned before that waste starts often in countries from the global south as resource extraction and also ends there again by being dumped there or by being brought there for recycling. And I remember that Subhasis said that a lot of people, I think your example was India, they work in the waste and recycling industry. But as far as I understand, it's not jobs that are desirable, that people do because you earn much or because they want to do it because they have no other choice. Yes, exactly. And so I wonder if this is something that we kind of impose from the global north on the global south, bringing our waste for recycling under really bad and polluting conditions. Even if it provides jobs, it's not good jobs. And I wonder if this having people into jobs that are bad but that keep them busy does not impede, if this impedes the need for higher education for these social classes that could get better jobs if they had access to better education, but with keeping them busy with bad jobs that just get them somehow through the week, if this is not actually something that could be abolished and by circular economy and maybe help promote education, help promoting the need for structural change also in these countries, not only for our global north circular economy interests. That's what I mean. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to explain for me.
No, but can I answer that?
Yeah,
Melanie?
please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think if I understood you, Regina, I think that's a great question. First of all, you opened up a lot of spaces where I don't think I have any qualification to answer, but you are basically saying that, you know, these are jobs people are forced to do. And if we talk about circular economy in a bigger scale, they will be continued to be forced to do this. And will that not really make their life, you know, worse? If I could understand that. And isn't there a better alternative to educate them and look for better jobs? So I think the main difference in my experience is that the large-scale urbanization of the West and the rural-urban divide, at least in India, is you have to understand that. So the people who do, for example, shoe repair, or the people who collect the waste in our neighborhood, are almost always moving from rural India to urban. And they're moving there. We are doing a study on the pandemic now, and you know, I'm drawing from the interviews we did then. So almost always they have moved out of their village because agriculture has failed. That's something you never hear in Germany or France or Spain, not so far. So they move because agriculture has failed, or they are under a debt trap with a loan shark, or they are a victim of a violence because they are untouchables and there is a violence, they are ethnic origins, indigenous, they are forced out. So these are the broad 3-4 groups of people who come to the city and become the underbelly of the formal economy. So that's why I said your question raises, I think, more questions, that if this migration keeps on happening of the people who move out of the villages because land is not providing the livelihood, this is the easiest thing to pick up in Delhi or Mumbai or Chennai or Kolkata. You know, pick up waste or repair shoes or, you know, do some of this stuff. So yeah, that's my reaction.
Okay, thank you. If it's okay, I would also pose a question in between, and then we have some more in the chat. So I also look at the time. But my question, maybe I ask it to Ilaha, because she she kind of opened a bit also my eyes on the role of civil society, because in everything we kind of formulate in Germany concerning policymakers, we always say integrate civic society, and I mean, we have a long tradition of labor unions and so on, so it might be totally different than in other countries maybe. And here NGOs have sometimes a very impactful role on the government and influence on the government. But I think another thing that we could really also question is how this mantra of doing everything in collaboration can also look different when you look into countries of the Global South. So what we are doing with the circular society area is to kind of round up all the R strategies, like reduce, rethink, recycle, with co-strategies like co-design, cooperate, collaborate, co-work, co-whatever. and this could also be quite different. And in countries of the Global South, I made experiences in Madagascar where we all had to we used a participatory approach, but who participate in the end were women who always had a lot on their plate already, and then they were so willing to participate in the project, and it didn't change anything for them in the end. So yeah, my question would be, what are your experiences, and how can we kind of transfer the good idea of doing things in differently to those contexts?
Is it a question to us or to the general audience?
It was a question to you because you raised this, the critiques on the involvement of NGOs. So yeah.
Yes. So just to highlight that, I don't think having participated in the collaborative approach, it's a problematic itself. I think that's just most how we enable, how we use it is problematic. And there are some good uses for that, and that also exists in European Union, but also across the different countries. But it is tricky, especially if we are operating in the context of the low and middle income countries. We should take into account a lot of formal and informal matters, as it has been mentioned already a few times, the power relations, or I don't know, sometimes a very simple thing like mobility, where you are actually having these participatory meetings and etc. And what kind of initiative, because my experience then when I went for the first time into East Africa, like most of, even you Google the initiative, it is like the very privileged initiatives that would come up, but how you reach out to those not being seen and not having a high visibility. And even those who do not define themselves as circular initiatives, for example, how you bring them to the table, and how you enlarge this conversation and discussion with really open space and open agenda and open discourse. So that's the main, I think that's the core of this approach. If you want to have a participatory approach, that's a really core where you should start. Like having different stakeholders. I don't want to demonize private sector. I think private sector is very important. State is very important. Municipalities are very important, but like having a really equal and inclusive approach. Who are you bringing to the discussion, and who are not bringing? How you're bringing the initiatives that do not associate with circularity, and what also you're trying to achieve with these collaborations. And so in a way, it is positive. It's possible. I'm quite positive about it. I think it's possible. There are good example archetypes of how you can do that, but it is very different depending on the context. So context is very much key when you're operating in most of the spaces in the world, also in global north. Like sometimes we also tend to like having a unified understanding, but the global north also can be different. I mean, the context of Italy is very different context of the Netherlands. So I think you should know that context you're operating, and also you should really collaborate with them and not just come and impose. One interesting example is the example of the project, which is called Flip Flop. It's on the Lamo Island, and they do collaborative project. Actually, it's a material circularity on plastics, and they involved different countries because they operate both in the Indian Ocean, but also Lake Victoria, where they involve Tanzania, Uganda, neighboring countries, and initiatives, but also governments. And so that project this kind of projects give me hope that it is possible to have this kind of collaborative approach, but you should have a like a real inclusive like inclusion, and also, but then what comes out of that collaboration is a big question, because even the project that I've mentioned, the policy paper and the actual empiric work has come out, but it is still a bit challenging to accelerate that to the main agenda of the policies on the country. And also because there is also lack of collaboration between the governments, because all the problems that we talk about, sometimes we forget that they are also global. Like, I mean, the issue of the plastic, issue of the textile waste, etc. They are not, the context is important, as I'm contradicting myself a bit, but context is important. But then collaboration between the governments is also important, between the regions is important. Like when there's a lack of collaboration within the African region, within the East Asia, within Latin America. So most of the countries, like if you look particularly the case of like Victoria is very interesting, because there is a huge case of the plastic issue, and also in the the shores of the continent, but there are no policies on the intercontinental collaboration. So every country does a bit of work with international organizations, but in the end, it is all very much anecdotal interventions that last for a year or two. So so yeah, I think that like to wrap up my argument is that collaboration should be not within the country, but also should be through inter countries and inter regions. And then I think it can be like that the outcome can be very, very much impactful.
Yeah. Could I say something on this point? Yeah. I think inclusion is not the right word to use here. And I think because the word inclusion suggests that something has already been built And now you're going to like bring the people who have been left out of that building to have them come in and say, okay, you are into this building. And I think that is problematic for several reasons, because first of all, it turns out we built the building on top of the people who were left out, right? So those people are like, you know, they are the bricks. They are the ground upon which the building was built. So if you try to pull those people in, the building might collapse, and it might collapse on top of everybody. And secondly, it also suggests that there is no opportunity to like change what the building is. So I think the frame of co-production, for example, might be a more useful one for us to think about, because I think unfortunately inclusion does give this sense that people are being brought into something that has already been conceptualized, and it can really be a dangerous word to, and it's being used everywhere now. Like everybody wants to include everyone, and I fear it could be a Trojan horse.
Okay, super cool. We are already at the end of this discussion, and I just would like to share some of my takeaways and then give you the last sentence, all of the three of you. Yeah, just very quickly, and I posted in the chat so you can see what my takeaways are and what we take with us to the next steps of thinking circular society global. Develop and install measures for reparation, which I find a wonderful term. I just wrote a book about repair, and I think it's a term that you can use a lot, a lot more in the next years. Reparation co-production instead of exploitation. Understand, map, and consider diversity in economic practices. Question, disrupt global resource waste flows, understand and reform global hegemonies and dependency enhancing international funding structures, decolonize Western ideas of how transition should look like, learning how to live and do economy with resource scarcity, develop a bottom-up circularity, how to support, develop ways of how to support whatever counts at civil society to enhance their political impact. And contested issues will remain, embrace them, and not everybody will be happy in the end, particularly those of power. So one last sentence to everybody of you, and make only one sentence, big task. And then, yeah, we are at the end of our forum. So Manisha, would you like to start?
Okay, great. I think the real task is we have to come back to the question of well-being, and how we can connect the circular economy transition to visions of well-being that can be more equitable for people both within and across the global north and global south.
Thank you. Ilaha?
Thank you, Melanie. I think I'll come my point to which was mentioned in the previous session, that the circularity is possible. It's a great concept, but we need to think in the sense not only as economy, but also sense of society. So what are the benefits and what is our role in that?
Thank you. Subhasis?
I would like us to step back from circular discussions of circular economy to circular relationships, and move away from take, make, waste relationships to relationships that build on each other, and think of love as the binding glue of that society. Okay,
great last word. Thank you very much. So I'm now saying goodbye to my three great panelists. I think we should go on with the discussion, not only once a year. So yeah, let's keep in contact. And yeah, thank you to all the participants. Thank you to my team, my teammates in the Circular Society Forum team. And yeah, let's see each other again, latest next year at the next Circular Society Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.